listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast by Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, Dr. Frederick J. Long, Dr. Mario Melendez, Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and J. M. Smith. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text. I am Michael Halcomb, and this is a Fallacy of the Week episode. Today we're going to be looking at something dealing with the New Testament, and in particular, 2 Thessalonians 2:15. All right, before we look at that though, I'm going to show you a fallacy. So if you're watching, you're going to have a little bit of an advantage. If you're just listening, that's fine too, because I'll read it out loud. So here we go. Let me pull this image up so we can look at it together. It's a meme that I've seen floating around for the last couple weeks now. And I think it's worth talking about. So here we go. It's two pictures. Really, it's the same picture, just split on the top half of the screen and then the bottom half of the screen. With the top half of the screen, it shows like perhaps it's supposed to be Paul, I think, before some other people, and then Paul again before some other people, top and bottom, same picture. So at the top, it says, "And Paul said to the Thessalonians, stand firm and hold fast to the traditions that you were taught, either by an oral statement or by a letter of ours." Now that's all in quotes. And Paul said to the Thessalonians, quote, "Stand firm and hold fast to the traditions that you were taught, either by an oral statement or by a letter of ours." And they asked, and this is in quotes, "So we go by scripture alone?" End quote. And now the bottom half of the meme, which is the same picture. Then Paul said, quote, "Okay, let's start over and see where I lost you," end quote. All right, the whole meme is sort of poking fun at the idea, the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, scripture alone, and modern believers who hold to such a view. Or you could just say it's really in general making fun of people who maybe have a higher view of scripture, but really Sola Scriptura is kind of in view because you have that "so we go by scripture alone" question. And I think there are a number of fallacies going on here. What I want to do is I want to turn our attention to the verse that's in reference. So if you're watching, I'm going to put that up on the screen too. So let me do that. This comes from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and the verse we're considering is verse 15. And the NIV translates it this way: "So then, brothers and sisters, stand firm and hold fast to the teachings we passed on to you, whether by word of mouth or by letter." So the NIV is pretty close to that, but let's look at it in Greek, and we might see something different straight away. Araun adelphou. Therefore, siblings is how I would translate that. And the ara here, this is a particle. It can be denoting a question. It can function as a therefore, but you have un here, which is also a word that functions as therefore. All right, so this ara is denoting sort of a finding of information that's going to happen. But either way, you can do something like, "So then, siblings, stekate, y'all stand firm, ke kratite tas paradosis, and grasp or hold or cling to the traditions, as didactete," as here functioning as a form of the relative pronoun os, right? And it's as because it's a feminine form of the pronoun. So as edidactete ite dialogu. So which y'all were taught. And then we have ite dialogu, ite the epistoles emon. Now you can do either or with ite, or you can do whether, right? Whether, and that's probably what's in mind here. So we have whether, dialogu. So we have dia with the genitive, and when we have it with the genitive, the idea is that by, right? By means of, or by. So by means of a word, logu literally being a word. Now that has a broad semantic range. It can mean a bunch of things, but logu is just a word. Whether by word or, and then we have the with the epistoles, the genitive, by letter, emon, of ours, right? So the question that I have is, if this was meant to be translated as by word of mouth, why not use the word mouth in Greek? Via logostomatos, something like that, right? By word of mouth, via logostomatos. Or why not use rhema, which is often associated more with the spoken word? So here we have logo in the genitive, and that's why I don't like this whether by word of mouth or by letter. It's really whether by word, whether by letter. And so you might say, well, the contrast is meant to be spoken, a written letter. The opposite is spoken word. Well, not necessarily. So the NIV says word of mouth, and if we go back to the meme, you see that it takes a pretty big liberty here. It says an oral statement. Okay, so that's pretty different than just word of mouth, oral statement, and word. Okay, so I'm treating this as whether by word, whether by a letter of ours. Okay, so we have here already a kind of language fallacy going on. They're able to use logos, or the genitive form logu, sort of slant their views and be ambiguous. So we might have an ambiguity fallacy. I think we do have an ambiguity fallacy going on here, right? So some other things to think about then is that I think we may also have a false dichotomy going on here, because the statement may be, I think it is presenting a sort of false dilemma when it suggests that something like Sola Scriptura, which is a much later doctrinal view, by the way, when it suggests that Sola Scripta, let me just pause there. Nobody in the text was nobody in the real scenario. And by the way, this is a made up scenario. The Thessalonians didn't reply this way. So that's a second thing other than the fallacy of ambiguity. But no, the Thessalonians didn't really say this. So now we have the fallacy of putting words in somebody's mouth. Okay. And also, this is just a fictional scenario. And in the context of Thessalonians, they weren't arguing about Sola Scriptura. So we have anachronism sort of reading the whole Sola Scriptura thing back onto this, although that's in a way part of what the creator of the meme is trying to convey, that the Thessalonians weren't arguing about Sola Scriptura. True. But does that mean that it's an illegitimate doctrine or view to hold? No. Elsewhere, Paul might well say things that lend itself to the idea of Sola Scriptura and the development of that doctrine. And one thing that what I think this is doing in terms of a false dichotomy or false dilemma is pitting written scripture against verbal testimony, when in fact in the verses Paul's saying hold to both, right? And the meme is saying hold to both, and then it sort of goes against itself. It folds in on itself. So I think there's a false dichotomy perhaps going on here. And I also don't think that Paul is attempting to equate one of his letters with scripture at this point. And we also don't know that Paul was equating the authority of his letter with the authority of any other word. Now, they want to say spoken word or oral statement. That's not necessarily correct, right? The Greek doesn't necessarily convey that. But it isn't clear that Paul is giving his letter the same authority as the authority of any other word. So you got to import that into the context to make the whole argument that the meme does. I would also say I think there's some cherry picking going on here, because what you have is this selective evidence choosing, and that's what happens when you're cherry picking, right? You're selectively you're selectively choosing evidence that supports your argument while ignoring contradictory evidence. And in this case, I think we might have cherry picking with regard to Paul's statement to the Thessalonians, as I hinted at earlier, while ignoring other passages or interpretations that support the later notion of sola scriptura. And I would say that we have anachronism going on here, perhaps on a number of levels. But yeah, the whole issue of sola scriptura, that's not what they were talking about. Again, the meme is trying to make that point. I think it's trying to make that point in a roundabout way. But also in doing that, it's bringing a later historical idea in to that sort of clouds things. And yeah, I think let's see. I was looking at this, and the other thought I had was maybe there's a hasty generalization going on here, because the argument might assume that this also touches on what I was saying a minute ago, that one instance or an instance of verbal testimony can negate the entire concept of sola scriptura, right? And I think that's wrong, or that that one word can negate all of Paul's letter. No, again, the important thing to remember is that Paul is saying hold to both of them. And here's the clarifying thing: when they're trustworthy, right? Obviously, Paul isn't going to say, accept a word that contradicts my letters, right? He isn't going to, or a letter from us. He isn't going to say that. So any oral testimony, if that's what we're talking about, or oral statement, or oral tradition, or word that comes along that comports with Paul's letter or letters, then that should be accepted, right? But if it's a word that comes along that doesn't comport with Paul's letter, then reject it, right? So we're not attempting to equate all words or all oral statements or all oral testimonies or whatever word comes down the pike with Paul's letters. They have to be in agreement with Paul's letters for them to have the same kind of authority. Yeah, so I don't know. I just found this meme. It's kind of humorous, but also I think people read this and it's a little bit hard to pick through and identify some of the fallacies, perhaps. And so I just wanted to take a crack at it, take a swing at it. And yeah, I'll stop there and I'll say I hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.